The wind hit the shutters like a warning shot. A dry, hollow sound rolled across the valley, carrying dust and memory in its wake. Out there beyond the dying light, Elias Ward sat in the saddle, a man shaped by too many wars and too few reasons to keep fighting. The sun was sinking behind Coyote Ridge, turning the rocks the color of rusted blood. His horse breathed heavy, and somewhere down the slope, a coyote cried a lonely sound that echoed longer than it should have. Elias didn't flinch. He'd heard too much already in this life, the crack of rifles, the last breath of men who didn't deserve dying, the silence after. But that night, there was something different in the wind, something fragile. A cry thin, human cut through the distance, carried by the same air that smelled of sagebrush and old gunpowder. He turned the reins slowly, eyes narrowing under the brim of his hat. Somewhere out there, past the ridge and the ghosts of his past, someone needed help, and whether he liked it or not, that was enough reason to ride again. If these old Western tales stir something quiet in you, stay a while longer. Hit subscribe so you'll be here when the next story rides in. The wind carried heat that day, thick, dry, and full of dust. It whistled through the broken slats of an old fence, rattling like bones that had long forgotten what it meant to live. Somewhere beyond that fence, a man rode alone. His coat was the color of old leather, his horse a patient shadow against the blinding sand. He didn't hurry. Men like him never did. Elias Ward rode as if the world had already taken too much from him, and he wasn't about to offer it anything more. The trail twisted along the ridge, cutting through rock and sagebrush. The air shimmered above the stones, and the horizon melted into a haze. Every few miles, he'd stop not to rest, but to listen. Out here, silence was a language. And Elias, he'd learned to hear it better than most. That afternoon, the silence broke. It started faint, almost mistaken for the cry of a hawk. But no, it was softer, human, a sound too desperate to belong to anything wild. Elias turned his horse toward it. The animal hesitated, ears twitching. He gave a quiet click of the tongue, and they moved slow at first, then quicker, dust curling around their legs like smoke. Down the slope, near a patch of mesquite, something glinted, metal, then movement. He dismounted, boots crunching over dry gravel. His hand brushed the worn grip of his revolver. Not out of fear, just habit. A few yards ahead lay a wagon, or what was left of one. The wheels had splintered, the frame half buried in sand. Flies buzzed thick in the heat, and beside it, a figure. At first, he thought it was a child, the body so still, so small against the earth. But when he knelt closer, he saw the curve of a shoulder, the torn edge of a dress, the faint rise and fall of breath. A woman. Her face was swollen, streaked with blood and dust. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope. Elias cut the bindings with his knife, careful, like unwrapping something sacred. She gasped when he touched her, eyes fluttering open blue, but dulled by pain. "Easy now," he said, voice low, steady as the wind. "You're safe." She tried to speak. No words came, only a broken whisper. Her lips formed a name he thought he heard: Henry. Then she fell silent again. Elias glanced around. The wagon had burn marks along the side. Bullet holes. Not the work of bandits. They'd have taken the horses, the supplies. This was something colder. A message? He poured the last of his canteen over her cracked lips. The water ran down her chin, darkening the dirt. When her breathing steadied, he lifted her light, too light, and set her across his saddle. The horse stirred. Elias laid a hand on its neck. "Steady. Boy, we're not done yet." He led them west, toward the ridge, where an old line shack still stood from the days when he wore a cavalry coat and answered to orders instead of ghosts. The shack leaned against the hillside, half swallowed by dust, but it held a roof and shade enough for now. Inside, he laid her on a cot, tore a strip from his sleeve, and cleaned her wounds with whiskey. She flinched once, but didn't wake. Elias watched her hand small, pale, scarred. One finger still wore a ring, silver gone dull. He wondered how long she'd been out there, how long since anyone had said her name. Outside, the wind changed. It came from the south now, carrying the smell of metal and smoke, somewhere far off. Thunder rolled not from the sky, but from the mines. Elias knew that sound. He'd heard it before when greed dug deeper than mercy ever could. He stepped outside, leaned against the doorframe, and rolled a cigarette. The match flared, bright against the dusk. The smoke curled upward, thin and slow. Through the fading light, he saw something half buried near the wagon wreck. A satchel, torn open, papers scattered like dry leaves. He walked back and crouched down. Most were maps hand-drawn, ink fading. One carried a name at the bottom corner, Henry Boone, engineer. He folded the paper, slipped it into his coat. Then, almost hidden beneath it, he found a smaller note, smeared with blood, a set of numbers, coordinates maybe, and a single word, silver. Elias looked toward the horizon, where the setting sun bled into the desert, silver vein. He'd heard whispers of it, a system of underground streams, a lifeline buried beneath rock and dust. And he remembered another name that used to come with those whispers, Silas Granger, the man who owned half the valley, and most of its fear. He went back inside. The woman stirred this time, turning her head slightly, her eyes open just enough to meet his. For a moment, they stayed like that, two strangers bound by the same quiet recognition loss. She tried to speak again. He leaned closer. "They killed my father," she breathed. Then, almost like a confession, "They'll come for me next." Elias said nothing. Words had no place here. He just reached for the blanket, pulled it over her shoulders, and sat down beside the door, Colt across his lap. The wind pushed through the cracks in the wood, carrying dust and the faint sound of laughter from far away rough. Cruel. The kind that didn't belong to men worth saving. He took one long drag from the cigarette, the ember glowing like a tiny sun in the dark. Somewhere deep inside, something old and buried stirred. Not anger, not yet. Just the memory of a promise he once made to protect what was still worth protecting. The night thickened, the desert cooled. He could hear her breathing now, slow and fragile, like the rhythm of a heart learning to trust again. Elias closed his eyes, let the smoke drift away with the wind, and whispered to no one in particular, "Tomorrow. We ride early." Outside, a coyote cried again from the ridge, its call stretching into the distance, thin and lonely as the man who listened. And when Elias finally looked toward the east, the first hint of dawn touched the edge of the sky, a faint shimmer of light that almost looked like hope. The fire in the hearth had burned down to red embers, soft and pulsing like the last heartbeat of a dying day. The old ranch house groaned every now and then, timbers settling under the cool desert night. Elias sat by the window, his silhouette etched in amber light, one hand resting on his knee, the other holding a cigarette that had long gone out. Outside, the wind shifted direction again, brushing against the cracked boards, carrying the faint smell of rain that would never come. From where he sat, Elias could see the outline of the hill's Coyote Ridge, sleeping under a sheet of gray dust. It had been 3 nights since he'd found Clara, 3 nights of silence broken only by the slow drip of water from the roof and the shallow breaths of the woman he'd carried from death's edge. Dr. Amos Finch had come the next morning, a man of medicine and wandering, his beard streaked with dust, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of a crushed hat. He'd seen enough wounded souls to know when life still clung by a thread. Without a word, he'd set down his bag, lit a lamp, and gone to work. Beside him was Jed Monroe, a man once known for finding things others wanted, hidden bounty hunter, detective, or something in between. He carried his weariness like another piece of gear. The 3 of them moved around each other in the cramped space, each speaking only when needed, their silence heavy but not hostile. When Clara finally woke, the morning light was soft through the curtains, painting everything in a thin gold film. She stirred, eyes searching the room before settling on Elias. "You stayed," she murmured, voice rough as gravel. Elias didn't answer right away. He poured a little water into a tin cup, handed it to her. She drank slow, careful, like someone remembering how. After a long pause, she whispered, "My father's name was Henry Boone." Her fingers trembled around the cup. "They killed him for what he found." Elias leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing. "What was that water?" she said, and the words seemed to echo in the quiet. "A stream beneath the ground, a whole network of it. He called it Silver Vein, said it could bring life back to this valley." She looked down, jaw tightening. He wasn't the only one who knew. "Peter Ward helped him, your brother, wasn't he?" Elias froze. The room seemed to shrink around him. The name hit harder than a bullet. Amos turned from the table, face somber. "Peter Ward's been gone near a year now. Folks said he headed north. Never came back." Clara shook her head. "He came back. To help my father. They mapped the streams together, but Silas Granger found out. He couldn't allow anyone else to own the water." Her voice cracked. "He made an example of them both." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Elias stared into it, his hand tightening around the armrest. He didn't speak, but his eyes told enough. The man had buried too many brothers already. Jed cleared his throat, quiet but deliberate. "You got proof of this." Miss Clara reached for her satchel near the bed. The leather was torn, edges burnt. She opened it, pulling out a small metal object wrapped in cloth. When she unfolded it, the silver gleam caught the firelight. A revolver, worn smooth with time. "He gave it to me," she said softly. "Said if anything happened, I should find the man who taught him to shoot straight." She looked at Elias. "That was you, wasn't it?" Elias took the gun gently, like touching an old friend's memory. His thumb traced the initials engraved on the handle, P. Iojinmiyu. He opened the cylinder, empty, but inside the hollow beneath the grip, his finger brushed paper, a small scrap folded tight. He pulled it out, smoothing it open on the table. It was a note, written in Peter's sharp, neat hand. Just numbers, at first glance. Then a word underneath Vein. Dr. Finch leaned closer, squinting. "Coordinates." Elias didn't answer. He was staring at the edge of the paper where the ink had bled into the fibers, the handwriting fading but familiar. "He always used to mark spots when we rode," he said quietly. "Creeks, fault lines, water tables. He had an eye for reading the land." Clara nodded. "Silas wants to control every drop. He's working with Western Dominion Mining. They're building dams, diverting streams, forcing the ranchers to buy their own water back. My father tried to warn the council. The night before he died, he told me he'd hidden the final map. And now they're hunting you for it," Amos said. She didn't reply. She didn't have to. The bruises on her face told enough. For a while, none of them spoke. Only the fire moved. Then Elias folded the note and slid it into his coat pocket. "We'll find it," he said simply. Jed looked up. "You mean to go against Granger? He's got men in every town from here to Carson City." Elias met his eyes, calm and cold. "Then we start with one town." The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was the kind of quiet that happens when men realize a line's been crossed and they're not turning back. Outside, the wind rose, sweeping across the plains, carrying the faint clang of a distant bell from the mining camp. Dr. Finch stood, stretching his back. "If we're going to do this, we'll need to move by night. Granger's eyes are everywhere come dawn." Elias nodded. "We'll rest till sundown." He turned to Clara. "You ride?" She gave a small nod. "I can." He believed her. There was something steady behind her weariness, the kind that doesn't break easy. As the others prepared, Elias stepped outside. The land stretched before him, endless and empty, painted in the pale gray of early evening. The sky above was streaked with red, like the world had been cut open and left to bleed into twilight. He lit another cigarette, the flame catching in the wind. For a moment, he thought of Peter, how his laugh used to carry across the riverbanks, how he'd always believed they could change this land for the better. The smoke burned slow, curling around his fingers before vanishing into the cooling air. From the open window behind him came Clara's voice, faint but clear. "You said we'll find it," she whispered. "Do you believe that Elias didn't turn around?" His eyes stayed on the horizon, where the last light was fading. "I believe in what he started," he said. Then he crushed the cigarette under his boot, and the night took back the sound. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rolled again, deep, hollow, like the earth remembering its secrets. And for the first time in a long while, Elias Ward felt something stir inside him. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of purpose. He stood there until the stars came out, one by one, over the quiet roof of the world. The sun rose thin and pale over the flats, turning the sand the color of old copper. The air was still, heavy enough to press down on a man's thoughts. From the porch of the abandoned ranch house, Elias Ward watched the horizon smolder under that washed-out light. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he hadn't noticed. The desert didn't need to move to make itself known. It breathed through silence, and silence was all he heard. Behind him, inside the dim house, Clara stirred quietly. The doctor was mixing something bitter-smelling over the stove, and Jed Monroe cleaned his rifle with the care of a man polishing regret. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light that came through the window slats, each one hanging for a moment before disappearing into the dim. Elias finally spoke. "They're close." No one asked how he knew. Some things you just feel in your bones. The night before, a rider from the rail town had brought word. A rumor, wrapped in fear. Silas Granger had sent for someone. A man who didn't speak much. Didn't miss much either. Folks in the saloon called him the Coyote. They said he worked in the dark, that when he came, dogs wouldn't bark, and even the wind went quiet. Elias had heard that name before, long before, back in the war, back when the world was nothing but mud, blood, and gunpowder smoke. He walked out to the corral, his boots stirring dust. The mare raised her head, snorting softly, sensing his mood. Elias ran a hand along her mane, eyes distant. He remembered a face half lit by cannon fire, shouting orders above the screams. A man who'd saved him once at Gettysburg. A man whose laughter he hadn't heard since. Now they said that man rode for Silas. He looked toward the horizon again. The line between sand and sky shimmered in the heat, as if hiding something. Maybe it was inside. "Doctor," Finch broke the silence. "How many days till we move?" "2," Elias said. "Maybe less." Jed spat into the fire. "You think this coyote's real?" Elias's answer came slow. The doctor looked up, brow furrowed. Elias didn't explain. He just reached for his hat, pulled it low, and stepped outside again. For a long while, no one spoke. Only the wind crept back through the cracks. That night, the world turned black and silver. The stars hung low, and the desert stretched like a frozen ocean. Elias lay awake, his back against the post, eyes open. Every sound, the creak of the boards, the shifting of the horse, even Clara's breathing felt louder than it should. Sleep didn't come easy for him anymore. Not since the war. He thought of Peter again, his brother, gone because of Granger's greed. Thought of the note, folded inside his coat pocket, the coordinates burned into his mind. Thought of Clara's voice when she said, "They killed him for what he found." And beneath all that, another memory rose older, heavier. A night of rain and rifle fire, a field slick with mud and death, and the man who'd stood beside him through it all. Nathan Ward, his cousin, the one they all thought had died in the smoke and thunder of Gettysburg. But Elias remembered the eyes, cold, calculating, even back then, and the way Nathan's trigger finger never trembled. He closed his own hand into a fist. The scar along his palm tightened, a reminder of what they'd lost and what they were still losing. Somewhere far off. A coyote howled, but this one didn't sound like an animal. It was too sharp, too exact. Elias's breath caught. He reached for his Colt and waited, every nerve tuned to the night. The sound came again closer this time, low and deliberate, echoing across the flats. Then nothing, only the whisper of the wind over stone. He waited until dawn before letting his hand drop. By morning, the world had gone quiet again. The sun burned away the chill, and the desert returned to its cruel brightness. Clara was sitting near the door, brushing the dust from her skirt. Her face was still pale, but her eyes had a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Elias nodded to her. "You heard it too?" She didn't look up. It wasn't an animal. No. For a moment, the room felt smaller. Dr. Finch packed his satchel, glancing between them. "Then we move today," Jed agreed, slipping his revolver into its holster. "The longer we stay, the easier we are to find." Elias looked toward the trail leading east. The light shimmered again, playing tricks on the eyes. He couldn't tell if the figure in the distance was real or just a ghost from memory. He turned back inside. "We ride at noon." When the sun hit its peak, the four of them rode out. The air shimmered with heat. Dust clung to their coats, their faces, even their thoughts. Miles stretched like hours. No one spoke. Then, as they passed through a narrow wash, Elias reined in. He dismounted, crouched low beside a rock, boot prints, fresh, too fresh. He touched the sand. Still warm. "Someone's been tracking us," he said quietly. Jed scanned the ridge, hand on his rifle. "You think it's him?" Elias didn't answer. He was looking at the pattern of the prints, measured, deliberate, just like Nathan used to make when scouting enemy lines. The doctor's voice dropped. "If it is, what do we do?" Elias stood, dusting his hands. "Keep moving, let him follow." Clara looked at him then, eyes wide. Why he met her gaze, calm and cold as stone. Because sometimes, to find the truth, you gotta let it find you first. They rode until the sky turned bruised with twilight. The air cooled, the world softening into shadows. When they made camp, Elias built a small fire just enough to warm, not enough to draw eyes from afar. He sat alone, turning the silver revolver in his hand, the metal catching the faint light. The initials on the grip gleamed like a memory refusing to fade. Somewhere out in the dark, something shifted. A single spark from the fire cracked, flaring briefly, then fell into the sand. Elias didn't move. He just whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "I know you're out there." "Nate?" The desert didn't answer, but in the silence that followed, the wind rose again soft, carrying with it the faint smell of gun oil and smoke. He looked toward the darkness, eyes narrowing under the brim of his hat. Somewhere beyond the firelight, a shadow moved, and then it was gone. The night came heavy and colorless. The stars were swallowed by a gray haze that stretched from ridge to ridge, and the moon hung low, pale as bone. Elias sat by the dying fire, the orange glow flickering across his boots, the smoke curling slow into the wind. He had the map laid out on a crate between them, creased, faded, edges torn from years of dust and use. Clara knelt beside it, a lantern in hand, her face half lit, half lost in shadow. She traced her finger over the lines and circles Henry Boone's handwriting, small and tight, like a man who knew the value of precision. Besides some of the marks, Peter Ward's rougher notes crowded in different ink, but the same quiet determination. Together, they made something fragile but true. Elias watched her hand move, steady despite the tremor in her wrist. "You sure about this?" he asked. Clara nodded. "My father marked the source veins here. And here." Her voice was faint, but clear. "But these symbols, these aren't rivers. They're measurements, pressure points beneath the salt ridge. It's where the streams meet underground." She looked up, eyes glinting in the lamplight. Salt Hollow. The name hung in the room, heavy, echoing like something half-remembered. "Doctor." Finch rubbed his beard, leaning over the map. "I've heard the locals talk about it. Ground's hollowed out like honeycomb under there. Dangerous place. You fall through. You're gone." Jed grunted. "Dangerous sounds about right. Outside." The wind dragged a low moan through the wooden slats of the barn. Elias folded the map carefully, tucking it back into his coat. "If Granger's planning anything big, it'll start there." Clara leaned against the post, exhaustion settling into her bones. "He'll use the hollow to tap the underground flow. Once he does, every ranch from here to Carson Valley will dry up. He'll control it all." Her words faded into the crackle of the fire. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, from the darkness beyond the door, came the soft crunch of footsteps. Slow. Measured. Elias's hand went to his revolver before the sound stopped. A voice called out, low but steady. "Easy. Ward. It's just me." A tall figure stepped into the light, brushing dust from his shoulders. His hat was weathered, his jacket patched with fur and time. The man's skin carried the copper hue of the high desert, his hair bound loosely with leather cord. He moved with the kind of quiet only men who've lived long among the wild can manage. "Finn Archer," Elias said, lowering his gun slightly. "Didn't think I'd see you again?" Finn smiled faintly. "Didn't think I'd come back." He stepped closer, eyes flicking to Clara. "Heard there was trouble brewing near Ghost Creek. I figured it had your name on it. Dr. Finch poured him a tin of coffee. Trouble's got everyone's name these days." Finn took the cup, drank deep, and set it down. "I rode past Ghost Creek this morning. Granger's men are there more than I've ever seen. They're setting up drill rigs, bringing in carts of blasting powder. Looks like they're fixin' to open the earth." Clara's breath caught. "The test well?" "Mm-hmm." Finn nodded. "They've got Shoshone scouts chained to the work lines. Folks say they're using them to find the soft spots underground. Once they hit the main vein, it'll bleed dry in a week." Elias's jaw tightened. The sound of his boots scraping the floor was sharp in the stillness. "How far?" "Half a day's ride," Finn said. "If you follow the dry riverbed and cut west through the salt flats." Jed's voice came quiet but edged. "If the coyote's still tracking us, he'll know that route too." Finn looked to Elias. "You really think it's him?" Elias didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat, pulled out the silver revolver, and turned it over in his hands. The firelight slid along the barrel, catching the initials again. "I know how he walks," he said softly. "I know how he shoots." Finn nodded once, slow. "Then I'll keep my eyes sharp." The group settled into uneasy silence. The fire burned low, throwing faint halos on the wall. Clara leaned forward, whispering, "When my father drew this, he believed the water could heal this land. He said it was the West's last mercy." Her hand brushed against the map again, gentle as if afraid it might crumble. But mercy doesn't last long in men's hands. Elias looked at her. The light touched her face, catching the weariness around her eyes, the same kind he'd seen in soldiers long after the war ended. He didn't say it, but he understood. The night deepened. Beyond the barn, coyotes called from the ridge. The sound rolled across the valley like a lament. Elias stood, pulling his coat tighter. We moved before dawn. Salt Hollow's waiting. Finn rose too, tying his rifle strap across his back. "You'll want to see it before they do." Doctor, Finch gathered his bag. Then let's hope the ground holds. When dawn came, it bled through the salt mist like a blade through cloth. The landscape shimmered white, barren, endless. Crystals of salt crunched under the horses' hooves, and the wind carried a fine powder that stung the eyes and throat. They rode in silence. Only the jingle of reins and the soft rhythm of hoofbeats broke the morning stillness. Clara rode between Elias and Finn, her scarf pulled high over her face, her eyes fixed on the horizon. After an hour, the land dipped suddenly, revealing a broad hollow carved into the ridge. The sun hit it at an angle, turning the surface into a mirror of blinding light. Steam rose faintly from cracks in the ground, where the underground streams breathed through. Finn pointed, Salt Hollow. It was beautiful and terrible, the kind of place that felt older than men, older than greed. Clara dismounted first, kneeling to touch the crusted surface. "It's alive," she whispered. "The water's moving beneath. You can feel it." Elias crouched beside her, placing his palm flat on the ground. The vibration was faint, steady, pulsing, like a buried heartbeat. He looked up toward the far ridge. Smoke coiled there, thin, gray, unmistakable. Finn followed his gaze. "That'll be Ghost Creek, Granger's camp." The group stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the discovery settling over them like dust. Then Elias said quietly, "If this land has a soul, this is where it bleeds." No one answered. The wind carried the faint clang of metal from the direction of Ghost Creek, echoing through the hollow like a warning bell. Elias took one last look at the map, then at the smoke rising in the distance. "We ride tonight," he said. The sun caught the edge of his revolver, a flash of light that vanished as quick as it came. And for just a heartbeat, Clara thought she saw something in his eyes, not anger this time, but resolve, tempered like steel in a slow fire. Far away, the horizon shimmered again, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. The moon rose thin and sharp, like a blade drawn halfway from its sheath. Its light spilled over the salt flats, painting everything in shades of silver and quiet. The group made camp in the hollow of an old wash, where the wind couldn't reach and the fire could stay small. Elias sat apart from the others, back resting against a rock, eyes fixed on the horizon. The night out here was never still. It hummed low, steady, like the earth breathing through its scars. Finn Archer crouched near the flames, tightening the strap on his rifle. The glow danced across his face, tracing the lines that years of solitude had carved deep. Clara sat close by, her hands clasped, the small cross around her neck catching a faint glint of light. Dr. Finch muttered something to himself, rummaging through his satchel for another match, while Jed Monroe carved lazy circles into the dust with his boot heel. The scrape of leather and steel was the only rhythm left in the silence. After a while, Elias spoke. His voice carried easy through the air, low but certain. "Granger's got the miners and half the county sheriff's men on his side. But he's got enemies too. He just don't know how close they're standing." Jed looked up, brow raised. "You're thinking of the railroad men?" Elias nodded. "Trans-Western Line? Edward Hale's the one funding Granger's digs. But, rumor has it, Silas plans to cut them out once he hits the vein. Keep the water, sell the rights, let the railmen choke." Finn leaned back on his heels, the fire reflecting in his eyes. "You mean to turn them against each other?" Elias didn't smile, but his silence said enough. "Dr." Finch chuckled under his breath. "Now that's a dangerous kind of clever." Elias finally turned toward them, his expression steady, carved in stone. "If Granger fights the railroad, his men scatter, his camps break. That gives us time to move on Salt Hollow to find what Peter and Henry left behind." The plan hung there, fragile but alive, like smoke that hadn't yet chosen which way to drift. Later, under the blue-gray light of the moon, Finn saddled his horse. The animal stamped once, restless. Elias walked up beside him, holding a folded sheet of paper, ink faint, letters sharp. "Message for Hale," Elias said. Tell him Silas is digging deeper than he's been told. Tell him he's got less time than he thinks." Finn took the note, tucking it into the inner pocket of his coat. "You sure about this?" "Once they find out who sent it." Elias cut him off gently. "They won't?" "Not if you ride quiet." Finn nodded, checking the cinch one last time. The moon caught on the knife at his belt, on the pale scars along his arm. He looked like he belonged to the desert itself, rough, silent, half ghost already. Before mounting, he paused. "If I don't make it back by sunrise, you'll know it worked." Elias's eyes met his, calm and unflinching. "You'll make it?" Finn swung into the saddle, gave a short whistle, and the horse took off at a steady trot, hooves muffled against the salt crust, fading into the horizon until nothing moved but the wind. Hours slipped by like water through cracked hands. The fire burned lower. Clara dozed, her head resting against a saddlebag, the faintest smile easing her features. For a brief second, Elias saw something almost peaceful in her face, a memory of safety that the world hadn't stolen yet. He looked away. The stars above shifted slow, old and watchful. Jed spoke up after a long silence. "You ever think maybe this ain't our fight?" Elias didn't answer right away. He picked up a small handful of sand, letting it run through his fingers. The grains glimmered in the moonlight like tiny bits of glass. "Maybe not," he said finally. "But it's our land, our people. Somebody's got to stand up for what's still worth keeping." Jed grunted, but there was no argument in it, just a sigh that carried years of weariness. "Dr." Finch closed his journal with a soft thud. "I've been patching up men in this desert for 30 years, he said quietly. "Doesn't much matter who they were, soldiers, miners, thieves. They all bled the same color, all looked to the sky before they died. I'd like to see a day when I don't have to clean the same wounds again." Elias looked at him, then back at the horizon where Finn had vanished. "Then we better make it count." The wind rose. A thin line of clouds drifted across the moon, dimming the world to gray. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called low, almost human in its sadness. Clara stirred, murmuring something Elias couldn't make out. He walked a few paces from the fire, staring into the dark. The desert stretched endless, and in its emptiness, every sound carried meaning. He thought of Peter again, the last letter he'd sent, the promises scrawled in dirt and ink. He wondered if his brother had known how deep this ran, how far Granger's shadow reached. A soft crunch of gravel pulled him back. Jed approached, holding something small in his hand, a brass shell casing, half buried near the rocks. "Found this by the ridge," Jed said. "Not one of ours." Elias turned it over under the moonlight, the mark on the base unmistakable, factory pressed, military grade, the same kind he'd seen back east, years ago. He closed his hand around it. "He's closer than we thought." Jed's jaw tightened. The coyote? Elias didn't answer. The fire flickered behind them, sending long shadows stretching across the sand. He looked back once toward the east, where Finn had ridden, and then to the west, where Ghost Creek's smoke faintly marked the night sky. Between them lay miles of silence, and somewhere in that silence, a reckoning. When dawn finally came, it crept slow and colorless. The wind had died. The world felt like it was waiting. Finn hadn't returned. Clara stood by the horses, her shawl drawn tight, watching the far ridge. Elias walked up beside her, boots crunching softly. "He's late," she said. Elias nodded. "He'll come?" But his voice didn't hold certainty, just faith, worn and fragile. They watched together as the sun breached the horizon, staining the salt flats pink and gold. The air shimmered, and for a moment, it almost looked like heat rising from the earth. Then they heard it, the faint rhythm of hoofbeats carried by the wind. Clara exhaled, relief breaking through. "It's him." Elias shaded his eyes, watching the small figure approach. Finn rode hard, dust trailing behind, But as he drew closer, Elias saw it blood on his sleeve, dark and spreading. Finn didn't slow until he reached them, sliding off the horse, breath ragged. Message delivered, he said between gasps. They took the bait. Hale's men are marching south. He staggered once, catching himself. Granger's camp will tear itself apart by nightfall. Elias gripped his shoulder, steadying him. You did good. Finn nodded, grimacing. Let's hope it was worth the price. The morning wind picked up, sweeping across the salt flats. It carried with it the faint echo of distant thunder, the sound of men and greed on a collision course. Elias looked toward the west, where the air trembled above Ghost Creek, and the horizon burned faint with heat. He whispered, almost to himself, "Then tonight, we go." The sun rose higher, catching the edges of his revolver, flashing once like a promise half kept, and for the first time in many years, the land felt alive again, restless, waiting for something to break. The dawn didn't rise so much as crawl. A thin gray light seeped across the desert floor, cold and colorless, touching the salt crust until it glimmered like frost. Elias Ward sat on his horse at the ridge's edge, the wind lifting the brim of his hat, eyes fixed on the valley below. Down there, the mining camp spread like a wound, tents, cranes, the slow churn of drills, smoke already curled into the morning. Men in canvas coats moved like ants across the flats, their voices lost under the metallic rhythm of tools biting into earth. Elias shifted the rifle on his shoulder, his jaw tight, beside him. Finn Archer checked the bandage on his arm, where the blood had dried dark through the cloth. Clara waited a few feet behind, her face pale under the shadow of her hood. The air smelled of salt and iron and something older, something buried too long. Finn spoke first, voice low. "They're already setting the charges." Elias nodded. "Then we're late. Jed Monroe and Dr. Finch crouched near the rocks, watching the camp through a spyglass. Finch exhaled through his nose. "Whole operation looks wired to blow. They're diverting the flow east, straight into Dominion territory." Elias's eyes narrowed, and drown every ranch between here and the foothills in the process. He pulled the silver revolver from his belt, checked the chamber, then slid it back with a click that sounded too loud for the morning. "We move in quiet, hit the main shaft first. If Granger's down there, I want him breathing long enough to talk." The others nodded, the kind of agreement that didn't need words. They left the horses tethered in the scrub and moved down the slope on foot. The salt crunched soft under their boots, each step swallowed by wind. When they reached the outer perimeter, Finn slipped ahead, knife glinting in his hand. A guard stood near the dynamite cart, half asleep, rifle slung loose. 2 seconds later, he wasn't standing at all. No noise, no struggle. Only silence reclaiming itself. Elias gave Finn a look, a nod that said, "Keep going." They weaved through the narrow lines of the camp, the morning fog thickening, turning shapes into ghosts. By the time they reached the mouth of the mine, the first sounds of gunfire echoed from the ridge behind. Jed cursed under his breath. "Hale's men got here faster than we thought." Elias didn't stop. "Good, let him draw the noise." Inside the mine, the air changed cooler, heavy with moisture. Water dripped from the walls, forming thin streams that ran through the dust toward the deeper tunnels. Lanterns flickered along the rock, casting their shadows long and strange. Finn led, his boots splashing softly in the shallow runoff. "There," he whispered, pointing, voices. They followed the sound through the twisting corridors until the passage widened into a cavern. The light flared brighter there, reflecting off damp stone, and in the center, surrounded by crates of explosives and coiled wire, stood Silas Granger. He was broader than Elias remembered Gray's suit, now stained with sweat and mud. Gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. Around him, engineers worked in fevered silence, laying lines, setting charges, checking fuses. 10 minutes till detonation. One of them muttered. Silas turned, eyes gleaming like oil in lamplight. "Make it 5. The sooner this mountain bleeds, the sooner we own it. Elias stepped from the shadows, voice calm but hard as the barrel of a gun. You don't own what's under this ground. Silas! The engineers froze. Silas's hand twitched toward his pistol, then stopped. A slow smile crept across his face. Ward, he said, didn't think you'd have the sand to crawl back here? Finn moved to Elias's flank, rifle raised, put the gun down. Granger? Silas laughed a short, brittle sound. You really think you can stop progress with a six-shooter and a conscience? Elias didn't answer. He walked forward, one step at a time, until the lamplight carved the lines of his face. This isn't progress. It's theft. Behind him, the ground trembled. The sound of drilling had stopped, replaced by the dull roar of gunfire outside. Hale's men had reached the camp. The cavern lights flickered. Silas's grin faltered. Looks like your plan's unraveling. Ward, you think you can outplay me? Elias's hand hovered over his revolver. No, he said softly. I think I can end you. And then, from somewhere deeper in the tunnel, came the sound that stopped them both. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Every man in the cavern turned. A shadow moved through the lamplight, tall, lean, wearing the dust of the desert like a second skin. A scarf covered his face, his hat low, and at his side hung a Colt that gleamed like liquid mercury. Finn whispered under his breath. The coyote. The figure stopped at the edge of the light. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just looked at Elias, and Elias knew. The air thickened, the space between them heavy with something older than hate, recognition, memory. Nathan, Elias said quietly. The man's eyes gray as Stormwater didn't flinch. He raised his gun in answer, slow and steady, like a ritual they'd both forgotten the words to. Silas, ever the opportunist, barked. Kill him, but Nathan didn't fire. Not yet. Elias took a step closer, voice barely above a whisper. Didn't think you'd crawl this low? Nathan's reply came soft, muffled under the scarf. We all crawl somewhere. Cousin? A single drop of water fell from the ceiling, landing between them with a hollow plink. Then, everything erupted. The first shot tore through the air, shattering a lantern. Light and shadow exploded across the walls. Finn fired next, the echo chasing itself through the tunnels. Silas shouted orders, diving behind a crate. Bullets sparked off stone. Smoke filled the cavern, thick and choking. Elias rolled behind a support beam, heart pounding. He could hear Nathan's footsteps circling through the dark, steady, methodical. The man hadn't lost his edge. Finn reloaded beside him, coughing. We can't hold this spot. Elias wiped blood from his cheek. We're not here to hold it. He peered through the haze and saw Silas crawling toward the detonator box, hand groping for the plunger. Finn Elias shouted. Finn took aim, fired. The bullet struck the plunger handle, splintering it. Sparks flew. The blast didn't come, but the rumble did. The water beneath the ground shifted, a deep groan rolling up from the earth's belly. Cracks spread along the cavern floor, and cold, gray water began to seep through. Nathan's voice rose above the chaos, calm as ever. You can't stop it now. Eli, the flow's already turning. Elias stepped into the open, gun drawn, the silver catching the flicker of the last burning lantern. Maybe not, but I can stop you. The two men faced each other across the rising water, reflections rippling like ghosts between them. Nathan tilted his head, eyes soft with something almost like pity. You always were the stubborn one. Elias raised the Colt, and you were the one who ran. The next sound was thunder, not from the sky, but from beneath. The ground shook, the lamps fell, water surged up, swallowing the noise, the smoke, the heat. And when the light died, only the echo of two gunshots remained rolling through the tunnels like the desert's last breath. The smoke hadn't settled yet. It clung to the air, thick and gray, curling through the broken beams like a ghost that refused to leave. The water still hissed from the cracks in the rock, turning the dust to mud that smelled of blood and iron. Elias Ward stood in the half-light of the collapsing cavern, chest rising hard, revolver still warm in his hand. The echo of the last gunshot hung somewhere between the walls and his heart. He couldn't tell which hurt more. Across from him, through the shifting haze, the figure moved slow, deliberate. The scarf had been torn loose in the blast, and what the light revealed froze Elias where he stood. Nathan Ward, older now, harder, his face lined by years and sin, but the eyes were the same gray that once looked out over the cornfields back home, the same that had smiled when Elias taught him to shoot tin cans off fence posts. Only now, there was no smile. Nathan's hand trembled slightly as he lowered his weapon. A trickle of blood ran down from his temple, cutting a line through the dust. "You should have stayed gone. Eli," he said. His voice was rough, quieter than Elias remembered, but it carried the weight of something that had been waiting too long to be spoken. Elias didn't answer. He stepped forward, boots sinking into the wet clay. Behind him, the cavern groaned, wood cracking, rock shifting. Finn's voice echoed faintly from somewhere deeper, calling his name. But Elias didn't turn. He kept his eyes on Nathan, the cousin he'd buried once in his mind, the brother he'd mourned beside a folded flag. Nathan smiled faintly, though it wasn't a kind thing. "Guess the war never really ends for us." "Does it?" Elias stopped 3 paces away. His revolver hung low, the barrel pointing toward the ground. "Why, Nate?" he asked quietly. Why crawl back for a man like Granger? Nathan tilted his head. "For once, someone paid me to win." Elias shook his head. Slow, no. "He bought you." The silence stretched thin between them, taut as wire. Nathan's jaw clenched. "You don't know what it's like out there. Eli, after Gettysburg, after everything fell apart, the army forgot me, the law didn't want me, the land didn't feed me. Granger gave me something to stand for again." Elias's voice was calm, but there was a rawness behind it. "He gave you a leash." Nathan's laugh was short, bitter. "And what about you? You think you're free? You fight for ghosts, for water that ain't yours, for a town that wouldn't spit on your grave." The words hit like a slap, but Elias didn't flinch. He just looked at him, really looked. Beneath the anger, he saw the boy who'd once shared his father's table, who'd slept under the same roof, called the same man Pa. A quiet fell then, deep and strange, the kind that happens when 2 men realize there's nowhere left to go but through each other. Elias holstered his gun. Slow. "If you're gonna do it," he said, voice barely above the drip of water, "do it clean." Nathan's hand tightened on his Colt, but his breath came uneven. "You think I can't? I think you won't?" For a moment. The only sound was the low hiss of water and the faint rumble from the tunnels beyond. Then Nathan lowered his weapon, the fight in his shoulders fading. "You still think you can save this land," he muttered. "Still think you can save me." Elias's eyes softened. "No, just hoping you'd stop killing what's left of yourself." Nathan's gaze flicked to the silver revolver at Elias's side, then back to his cousin's face. "That gun, Peter's, ain't it?" Elias nodded once. Nathan's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "He was a good kid." Elias swallowed hard. "He believed in you." Something in Nathan's expression cracked, small and sharp. "Yeah," he said, voice frayed. That was his mistake. The ground trembled again, a deeper rumble now, water roaring somewhere beneath their feet. A beam fell from above, smashing into the mud between them. Both men flinched but didn't move apart. "Granger's dead," Elias said quietly. "This ends here." Nathan looked up toward the falling dust. "You think so?" He gestured to the water. That river won't stop. You can kill every man Silas ever bought, and it won't stop. The land'll just keep swallowing itself until there's nothing left. Elias stepped closer, close enough to see the tremor in Nathan's hands. Maybe, but not today. He reached out then, slow, like offering a hand to someone standing on the edge of something too deep. Nathan stared at it. For a long heartbeat, it seemed he might take it. But his gaze drifted past Elias, to the tunnel mouth where light flickered faintly from the outside world. "I can't walk out of here beside you," he said, almost to himself. Elias's hand fell back to his side. "Then, walk out clean." Nathan's eyes lifted. There was something almost peaceful in them now. "You always did talk like Pa." Elias's reply came like a sigh. Somebody had to. Another tremor shook the ground, sharper this time. The cavern walls cracked, spraying mist. Finn's shout came again. Closer. Urgent. "Elias, we gotta move." Elias turned for a split second, just enough. When he looked back, Nathan had drawn his gun again, but the barrel wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at the detonator box across the chamber. Elias's voice broke. "Don't!" The gun fired. A single shot. The explosion tore through the cavern like thunder trapped underground. Flame met water, and the world split open in sound and light. Elias was thrown backward into the mud. The air ripped from his lungs. He saw Nathan silhouetted against the fire fall with the roof as the tunnel collapsed in on itself. Then, silence. Only the sound of rushing water, spilling through the cracks, washing away the blood, the dust, the name. Elias pushed himself up, coughing hard, the smoke burning his throat. The revolver still hung from his hand, the silver glint now dull and blackened. He looked to where Nathan had been, but there was nothing, just the shifting, gray current and the echo of his cousin's last words still lingering in the roar. "You always did talk like Pa." He stood there for a long time, the world around him crumbling slow. And when Finn finally reached him, grabbing his arm, pulling him toward the light, Elias didn't resist. He just whispered, more to the earth than to any man. Another war had gone to the dust. Outside, the dawn had broken full and harsh. The sky burned gold over the gray valley, and the wind carried the faint scent of salt and smoke. Elias turned once, looking back toward the hollow that had swallowed his kin. The desert answered with silence, and in that silence, something inside him shifted small, fragile, like a door creaking open somewhere deep in the heart. The world was breaking apart around them. The walls groaned like old timber under a storm. The air shook with every rumble from deep within the earth. Water poured through the cracks, cold and gray, finding its way down to the veins of silver below. Elias Ward pressed his hand against the rock to steady himself. His breath came ragged, smoke stinging his eyes. Through the haze, he saw Clara, her small frame bent against the weight of the tremors, her hands gripping the handle of Dr. Finch's scalpel. The blade caught the lamplight, a brief flash before the next wave of thunder rolled through the mine. Silas Granger was there, leaning against the dynamite cart, half his face bloodied but still grinning. His voice came rough and sharp, slicing through the noise. "You think killing me changes anything, Ward? The water's already ours." Elias didn't answer. His revolver hung low, ready. Silas stepped forward, dragging one foot, sneering through broken teeth. "You fight for a dead man's dream. You're nothing but a soldier without a war." The ground split again, water bursting from a seam like veins torn open. The cavern flooded ankle-deep in seconds. Behind Silas, Clara moved, quiet as a shadow. Elias saw it only when it was too late to stop her, the glint of steel, the arc of her arm. The scalpel drove into Silas's side, deep and deliberate. He gasped, stumbled back, eyes wide. For a moment he looked more surprised than hurt, staring at the blood soaking through his fine coat. Clara stood before him, her face calm, lips trembling but steady. "For my father," she whispered. For Peter, Silas lunged. Elias fired. The Colt's silver barrel flashed once, twice. The sound echoed through the hollow like thunder rolling down a canyon. Silas staggered, hit the edge of the broken ledge, and fell backward into the roaring stream. His body struck the water and vanished, pulled under by the very river he'd tried to own. The current turned red, then gray again. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice from behind the one Elias had prayed he'd never hear again. Eli Nathan Ward stepped out from the shadows, one arm clutching his side. His eyes burned with something fierce, part anger, part grief, all tangled like the roots of a dying tree. Elias turned to face him, the Colt still smoking in his hand. The air between them felt heavier than the mountain above. Nathan's voice broke, low and shaking. You just had to play hero. Elias's jaw tightened. Somebody had to. They stood like that for a breath that stretched too long. Then Nathan lunged. The two men collided, boots sliding in the water, hands clawing for leverage. The current swirled around them, rising, cold and relentless. Nathan struck first. His fist cracked against Elias's jaw. Elias staggered, then shoved him hard into the wall. The impact knocked loose a shower of stones. One caught Nathan's shoulder. He grunted but didn't stop. Their fight wasn't the kind that sought victory. It was the kind that came from years of unspoken words, of guilt and blood and kinship gone wrong. Elias caught Nathan's arm, twisted, forcing him down. Nathan pushed back, teeth gritted, eyes blazing. Peter believed in you, Elias shouted, voice hoarse. Nathan froze. The name hit him like a shot before he could speak, before Elias could say anything more. A single whistle cut through the roar of water. Then the arrow flew. It came from the shadows above the ridge where Finn Archer stood, bow drawn, rain dripping down his hair. The shaft cut through the air clean and fast, striking Nathan square in the chest. The sound that followed wasn't a scream, it was softer, a gasp, almost grateful. Nathan stumbled back, his eyes wide in shock, one hand reaching for the arrow as if to pull it free, then stopping halfway. His knees buckled, he sank slowly, the water lapping at his chest. Elias caught him before he fell completely, cradling him like a brother instead of an enemy. The blood spread quick in the rising flood, darkening the current. Nathan's lips moved. Elias leaned close. I didn't mean to lose him, Nathan whispered. His breath was shallow, eyes fading. I just didn't know how to stop. Elias's throat closed. Rest now. Nathan's gaze lifted to the light spilling through the cracks above. He almost smiled. Tell Pa I came home. Then he went still. Elias held him there, water swirling around them both, the sound of the collapsing mine roaring like the sky tearing open. Finn slid down the rocks, landing beside them, bow still in hand, chest heaving. You all right? Elias didn't look up. He laid Nathan gently against a slab of stone, the arrow still in place. He's gone. Finn exhaled, head bowed. Better him than you? Elias's eyes hardened. He was both. The light shifted again. The sun had reached the mouth of the cavern now, turning the mist gold. Clara stumbled toward them, her dress soaked, face streaked with ash and tears. She knelt beside Elias, trembling. It's over, she whispered. Elias looked down at the water, at Silas's blood still drifting through it like a shadow that refused to fade. Not yet. He holstered the Colt. The silver glinted once before disappearing beneath his coat. Clara's hand found his arm, light but sure. Peter he'd have been proud of you. Elias turned to her, and something in her eyes, something raw, unguarded, caught him off guard. She was still shaking, but her voice stayed steady when she said, You should know, Elias, the child I carry, it's his. Elias froze. The air seemed to stop moving. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then he nodded, slow. I reckon he'd have liked that. Clara's breath hitched. He wanted to build a place where the land fed everyone, not just the rich. He said the water was meant to belong to the living, not to men like Silas. Elias's gaze drifted to the flow, at their feet silver and red, swirling together. Then maybe now, it will, outside. The sound of the river grew louder, steady, unstoppable. They stood together at the cavern's edge, the light widening as the roof gave way, revealing a sky washed clean by morning. The flood carried Silas away, carried Nathan, carried the weight of all that had been done, and for the first time since he'd left the army, Elias felt the world breathe again. He turned toward Clara. "We'll see this through. For him, for all of them." Clara nodded, one hand on her stomach, the other clutching the old scalpel still stained with red. "For the living," she said. Elias watched the water one last time before stepping into the sunlight. The desert stretched wide before them, shimmering like glass. Somewhere beneath it, the silver vein ran free again, its current no longer chained, carrying both sin and salvation toward the open land. He took off his hat, let the wind touch his hair, and whispered something the others didn't quite hear, a promise, perhaps, or a prayer. Then they started walking toward the light, toward whatever came next, leaving the echoes of that cavern to fade into the steady hum of water and wind. The sun leaned down over Salt Hollow like a lantern held low. The smoke had thinned to a gray veil, and the wind moved it in gentle folds across the flats. Water, cold and clean, slipped from the cracked mouth of the hill and crawled into the basin. Silver, quiet, certain. Elias Ward stood knee-deep in that light and listened to the earth breathe. Hoofbeats rose from the south. A long line of riders cut across the salt dust. Leather, the click of bridles. At their head came a man in a dark frock coat and city boots that had never learned desert sand. 2 flags hung behind his escort, the red crest of the rail company, and the blue of the territorial marshal's office that someone had borrowed for courage. The man dismounted slow, as if the land might break under his weight. Edward Hale, rail-bred, watch chain, bright as a blade. His eyes took in the wrecked camp, the buckled timbers, the broken winch wheels, the stream that now ran where maps had said dry. Gunfire popped on the far edge of the flats, short bursts. Angry and uncertain rail guards trading shots with Dominion men who had not yet learned they had lost. The sound carried thin on the wind, a reminder that peace, like water, never arrives all at once. Hale's gaze found Elias. "Mr. Ward," he said. "Careful. Not friendly?" "I expected Silas." Elias didn't blink. So did he. The wind shifted. Clara stepped forward from the shade of a broken rig, dress still wet, hair pulled back with rough hands. "Doctor." Amos Finch walked beside her, hat in hand, eyes quiet. Finn stood off to one side, bow stowed now, his palms easy on the reins. Jed Monroe watched the ridgelines with the patience of a man who'd seen too many ambushes begin with a handshake. Hale noticed Clara and the papers she held against her chest, stiff vellum, edges singed, tied with a thin strip of leather. That small bundle seemed to pull his eye like iron to a magnet. "What's that?" he asked. Clara didn't answer at first. She stepped closer, letting the light find her face. She looked smaller than she felt, but her voice carried steady. "Designs," she said. "Mr. Hale. These are the original plans for the Silver Vein system. My father's hand, Henry Boone, with annotations by Peter Ward." Hale's mouth tightened at the names, then loosened again. "Out here." Dead men still made introductions. Clara held the papers out. Hale didn't take them. Instead, he glanced to Elias as if permission needed to pass through a man in a dusty coat, and not the woman who'd bled to save them all. Elias met Hale's look, then kept his own eyes on the water. The pause stretched. Then Hale lifted the packet gently, like he'd been offered a newborn in church. He untied the leather. The vellum cracked soft, old fibers waking. He knelt in the salt and spread the sheets on an overturned crate. The men around him leaned in rail guards, miners with eyes still hot from loyalty, 2 deputies with sweat darkening their collars. The papers smelled of lamp smoke and river mud. On them lines, circles, notes tight as stitches, pressure readings, intake gates, a wheel designed for a community pump at the edge of town, not at the mine head. Beside the wheel, a small note in a younger hand. 15 households first. Rotate weekly. No exceptions. Peter's hand, clear as the day he'd written it. Hale traced that line with a clean fingertip. He looked up at Clara. "This splits the flow. It shares it," she said. "Doctor..." Finch stepped close enough for Hale to hear his breath. "Those measurements are real. I've been 10 years on this soil. Spring, drought, flash flood. I've watched it all. Henry Boone and Peter Ward read this land like scripture." The pop of gunfire came again from beyond the rigs. Then silence. A gull's cry drifted off nowhere and was lost. Hale's jaw worked once, twice. His voice softened, not by sympathy, by math. Granger promised priority to Dominion shafts. Tied the rest to a lease we drafted in Reno. He lifted his head. He told me he could own this. Elias finally spoke, tone low as a stone in a riverbed. "You don't own water here, Mr. Hale. You shepherd it, or it buries you." Hale studied Elias like a man looks at a mountain before deciding to go around it. He folded the top sheet back and found another Peter's notes on a relief cut west of town. A diagram for a safety spill into the old irrigation ditch by the chapel. He read in silence, the way a man listens to a grave. Something in him gave. You could see it in the shoulders. He stood, dusted his knees, and turned to the nearest guard. "Call the ceasefire," he said. "Now?" The guard hesitated, then cupped his hands to his mouth and whistled high. 3 sharp notes. The sound carried clean as a blade. From the flats, a second whistle answered. Shots stopped. The desert breathed. Hale faced Clara again. "These designs, if we adopt them, will need oversight. Gates, schedules, disputes will come." He looked to Elias. "You plan to arbitrate with a Colt." Elias's eyes flicked once to the silver at his hip, then back. "Only if someone tries to steal what keeps children alive." "Doctor..." Finch set his medical bag on the crate and pulled out a leather-bound journal. He flipped to a page, scrawled with neat entries: wells, depths, summer flows, winter drops. He tapped a line with a blunt finger. "We can read the rise and fall. We can manage it like a heartbeat." Clara set her hand atop the vellum light. "Steady." "Call it the Silver Vein Accord," she said. "A pact that states what this water is for. People, town, company, none holds it alone." Hale looked past her to the stream, turning the salt a soft gray. He seemed to measure not just gallons, but years. Then he nodded once. "Decision made. Fine," he said. "We'll draft and sign it here." He reached inside his coat and pulled a small metal case, snapped it open, and took out a fountain pen with a black body and a gold nib. In the West, men sometimes raise guns to show power. Sometimes they raise pens. Both can end a life. One can save it. Jed had already found a clean plank and set it across 2 buckets. He laid the vellum flat. Hale uncapped the pen. The nib flashed and then bent to the page. His handwriting was thin and practiced. A clerk's child turned into an executive's father. He wrote the title Silver Vein Accord, then a first clause shared governance of flow. Priority to household and grazing needs in periods of scarcity. Proportional shares to municipal and rail interests. No exclusive rights granted or implied. The nib scratched in the quiet. The wind leaned close to listen. Hale paused. "We need a witness outside my employ." He lifted his chin. Dr. Amos set his palm on the plank, as if steadying a body for sutures. "I will, "And a representative by the land," Hale said, eyes moving to Elias. Elias stood still for a breath. He wasn't a man for boards or councils, but he knew what Peter would ask. He stepped forward, set his hand beside the doctor's, and rested the Colt's weight against his thigh like a promise kept. "I'll sign." Clara's gaze flicked to the sheets, then to Hale. "Add one more line," she said. "A council of 5, 1 from the rail, 1 from the town, 1 from the ranchers, 1 from the Shoshone, 1 sworn to the water itself." Her eyes softened. "Not weak clear. That last one can be replaced by a vote if he ever forgets what he's for." Hale considered. That city schooling moved behind his eyes like the teeth on a gear. He looked to Finn. "You'll speak for the Shoshone." Finn shook his head. "I'll carry the offer. They'll send their own voice." His tone made plain that was the only right answer. Hale wrote the clause, signed, then slid the plank toward the others. "Doctor." Finch signed first, the ink dark and sure. Elias took the pen. His hand dwarfed it. He had not written a neat line since the army mustered him out, but the letters found their way. One by one, Elias Ward. The name sat there like a fence post driven true. Clara added hers, Clara Boone, beneath her father's, on the old designs. And for an instant the page seemed to carry 3 hands at once. Jed signed as a witness. Finn, only after a slow breath, added a mark in the margin where a Shoshone name would later live. He placed his palm to the page and lifted it away, leaving the faintest salt print. No ink needed. A rail sergeant stepped forward with a notary stamp they'd pocketed for land deeds. He pressed it hard near the bottom. The paper took the seal with a crisp, wet hiss. Silence again, not empty full. The way a church feels when the last hymn hangs in the rafters and folks are deciding whether to kneel or walk out into the sun. Hale capped his pen. "The line will build a cistern at the chapel ditch and fund 2 wheel pumps by the mill," he said, as if rehearsing terms to himself. "We'll pull our guards today. Dominion men can stay if they swear to the accord by sundown." He looked toward the ridge, where spent smoke made thin flags in the heat. "And we'll wire Carson City." Elias nodded once. "Do that." Clara rolled the vellum back into a tight cylinder, tied it with the same thin leather. She held it a moment longer than needed, as if listening to something inside it settle. A breeze came down the basin. It lifted the edge of the plank, fluttered the corner of the accord, and went on its way, ruffling the surface of the new stream. Sunlight broke clean over the water. It made a small ladder of white that climbed the current and disappeared into the flats. Elias watched that light. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Beside him, Clara shifted her hand, and for just one beat, her fingers touched the back of his. Soft, barely there. He didn't move. He didn't have to. Across the basin, a rail bugle sounded a single note. Men lowered guns. Somewhere. A child laughed at the way the water lapped at her boot, and her mother told her to mind the hem. The desert held all of it, the ink drying, the rifles quieting, the river beginning, and in that small minute, the West felt like it might learn a new word for mercy. The wind set a single willow switch dancing by the chapel ditch, and then was still. The summer came early that year. Rain fell soft and steady for 3 straight days, the kind that sinks into the ground and wakes up roots thought dead. When the clouds finally broke, the fields around Silver Vein shimmered green thin at first, then deep, like the earth remembered what it was made for. Children ran barefoot along the new ditches, splashing where water cut through the old furrows. Women hung linens that smelled of soap and sunlight. The men from the mill came down to help set the second wheel, and for the first time in years, laughter rolled over the ridge louder than gunfire. Elias watched from the porch of the bunkhouse they'd fixed into a meeting hall. His hat lay on the rail beside him, and his hands were stained with oil from the pump gears. The creak of the wood beneath him sounded almost like music, an old, simple rhythm that asked for nothing more than quiet. Across the yard, Clara was kneeling by the trough, sleeves rolled up, rinsing the dirt from a basket of wild onions. Her hair had grown longer. The wind kept lifting it into her face, and each time she brushed it back with that same calm patience that had carried her through fire. Dr. Amos Finch sat nearby, writing in his journal with one knee propped up, spectacles low on his nose. Finn leaned against the fence, eyes half on the horizon, half on the sky. They all worked in silence, not the heavy kind, but the kind that fills a space with peace. It should have felt like an ending, but Elias knew better. When you've lived long enough under a war's shadow, you learn that peace is a fragile thing. You hold it like a wounded bird. You keep your hand steady, knowing it might still die. A rider came from the east that afternoon, trailing dust and worry. The horse stumbled into town, its flanks white with sweat. The man dismounted before it stopped moving and shouted before his boots hit the ground. "Hale's dead." The words hit the square like a gunshot. People froze mid-step, mid-breath. Elias stood slow, hand still resting on the rail. "What did you say?" The rider swallowed, voice trembling. Edward Hale, found him in his room at the Silver Spur Hotel in Reno, shot in the chest, close range, marshals saying. It was an Indian hand did it. The air went still. Finn straightened from the fence, eyes hardening. "Whose word Dominion men spreadin' it?" the rider said, swearing it was Shoshone retaliation. There's talk they'll ride south, tear up the Accord. Clara stood, water dripping from her hands. "That's not true." Elias's jaw worked, muscle tight along his cheek. "Truth don't matter when men smell profit." The rider looked between them, unsure what to do with the silence he'd carried here. Then he tipped his hat, murmured a sorry, and turned his horse back toward the trail. The sound of hooves faded into the grass. No one spoke for a while. The wind moved through the wheat like a sigh. Amos finally closed his notebook. Slow. "You think Dominion did it themselves?" Elias nodded once. "They never meant to honor the Accord. Hale's death just gives them a flag to wave." Clara stepped closer to him. "So what do we do?" Elias looked out at the horizon, far off. A dust cloud shimmered where the road bent east, a company convoy maybe, or worse. "We get ready," he said softly. Finn crossed his arms. For war again? Elias shook his head. For what comes after it? A long pause hung there. The afternoon light stretched thin across the yard. Somewhere a hammer struck metal in the blacksmith's shed, steady, patient, unafraid. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt and faced the others. "We have proof. Amos has records, my father's papers. We can take it to Carson City, to Governor Stone himself." Amos frowned. "You think he'll stand against Dominion money?" Clara's voice stayed calm. "He signed as witness to the Accord. That makes him bound, same as any of us." Elias studied her for a moment, her eyes, sharp with resolve, her shoulders set though she trembled inside. He felt something shift in his chest. Pride, maybe, or fear, maybe both. "Then we ride at dawn," he said. Finn nodded. "I'll take the northern pass. Shoshone need to hear before the soldiers do." Amos closed his bag. "I'll ready the documents?" Clara turned to Elias. "And you?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries no joy but no regret either. "I'll make sure we get there alive." Night came quick that evening. The wind turned cool, bringing the scent of wet sage and faraway rain. Elias sat outside the hall after the lamps went out, the stars gathering over the ridge like old friends returning. The pumps creaked slow, steady. Each rotation of the wheel sent ripples down the ditch, catching the starlight like shards of glass. He thought of Hale, not the man's polished boots or the gold-nibbed pen, but the look on his face when he saw Peter's handwriting. For a moment that day, Hale had seemed human. Maybe that was what got him killed. Footsteps approached soft behind him. Clara. She carried a lantern, the flame small but warm against the dark. "You should sleep," she said. "Sleep's harder when things get quiet," he replied, She stood beside him, lantern light tracing her face. "You've been fighting too long, Elias." He didn't answer right away. The crickets filled the pause for him. "Finally," he said. "You ever notice how men always think peace means laying down guns? Sometimes it just means learning where to aim 'em different." Clara tilted her head. "And where do you aim now?" He looked out toward the horizon again, where the faintest flicker of lightning stitched through a cloud. "Toward the truth, I reckon. If I can still tell what it looks like." She was quiet, then reached into her pocket. When she spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "Peter once said the same thing, said truth was like water. It don't stay where you tell it to. It finds its own way." Elias smiled, soft and sad. He was right. They stood together for a while, saying nothing, just listening to the land breathe. The night carried the scent of wet soil and smoke from the blacksmith's forge, where embers still glowed faintly. Somewhere, a coyote called one long note that echoed over the plain. Clara's hand brushed against his. For a second, neither pulled away. "He would have liked to see this," she said. "Maybe he does," Elias murmured. A gust of wind passed through, dimming the lantern. It flickered, caught again, held steady. From the ridge, a faint light appeared. Campfires, too many to count, moving slow along the road from the east. Elias's eyes narrowed. "They're coming," he said quietly. Clara followed his gaze. The color drained from her face. "Dominion, or men dressed like 'em." He rose, took his hat from the rail, brushed the dust from it. "Either way, they'll want blood." She looked at him. Fear held tight behind her calm. "And you." He set the hat on his head, eyes fixed on the glow across the plain. "I'll give him a reason to think twice." He started down the steps, boots creaking, his shadow long across the yard. Behind him, Clara's lantern light trembled once, then steadied. The pumps turned on again, slow and faithful, pushing silver water down through the ditches, feeding the fields, and though the sky above promised another storm, for that moment the land was green. The dawn came pale and slow, stretching gold fingers across the ridge. The air still smelled of wet sage and coal smoke. Elias tightened the last strap on the mule's pack, the leather creaking like old bones. Beside him, Clara adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, her breath fogging in the cold. The mountains ahead looked endless, 4 days of rock, dust, and wind. Behind them, silver veins slept under a thin mist, the pumps whispering in rhythm with the river. No one said much when they left. Words felt small against the weight of what they carried. The road to Carson City wasn't just distance, it was the measure of hope. Amos Finch rode ahead on a bay mare, hunched over his satchel of papers, his hat pulled low. Jed Monroe followed behind, eyes scanning every ridge, every shadow. He never stopped moving his left hand, checking his revolver, then his watch, then the revolver again. Finn brought up the rear, quiet as a ghost, his bow slung across his back. Elias rode at the center, keeping pace with Clara's horse. She sat straighter than she should have, heavy with child, but her gaze never faltered. Every mile seemed to draw her deeper into some quiet resolve. By the second day, the path narrowed into canyons where the sun reached only for an hour. The wind carried sand that hissed against their coats, and the horses' hooves echoed off the stone like heartbeats too slow to trust. At camp, the fire burned small, just enough for warmth, not for comfort. Elias sat close to the glow, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. Clara watched the sparks drift upward like tiny stars trying to find their way home. "Doesn't feel real yet," she said softly. "What doesn't?" Elias asked without looking up. "All of it. The water, the fields, the accord." She paused, running her fingers over her stomach. "Feels like it could vanish if we blink too long." Elias set the knife down. "Maybe it's meant to feel that way. Things worth keeping never come easy." The wind sighed through the canyon, tugging at the edges of the fire. Clara smiled faintly. A tired kind of smile. "You sound like Peter." Elias didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the flame, and the silence between them felt almost kind. They rode on through the third day beneath a sky too wide to hold. The desert flattened, then rose again, and in that shifting landscape, men learned patience or they broke. Around midday, a dust plume appeared far behind them, a column, narrow and sharp. Jed noticed first. Riders. Finn turned in his saddle, squinting. Could be Dominion scouts. Elias shaded his eyes. The dust moved steady, not fast, maybe a half-dozen horses, maybe more. "Keep riding. Don't look back." By sundown, the plume had vanished, but so had their ease. That night, they camped by a dry creek bed. The stars came cold and bright, and the fire burned low, snapping once in a while like it too remembered gunfire. Finn sat apart from the rest, whittling a piece of pine into the shape of an arrowhead. He wasn't carving for use just to keep his hands busy. Amos read through the documents by lantern light, muttering now and then. Dates, signatures, proof enough to hang a man if anyone still believes in truth. Elias lay back on his bedroll, hat over his face. "Truth's like water," he said. "It runs toward whoever digs the deepest hole." Amos looked up, the lines in his face carved by light and regret. "And what if that hole's a grave?" Elias didn't answer. The night didn't need him to. On the morning of the fourth day, they reached the high pass. From there, the land fell away like a breath finally exhaled. In the distance, Carson City shimmered under a veil of heat-white buildings, smoke from a dozen chimneys, a river cutting through like a silver thread. As they descended, wagons passed them, merchants, soldiers, travelers all carrying stories they'd never tell. News traveled faster than wind in those parts. By the time they reached the city gates, whispers had already run through the taverns. The silver vein accord was breaking. Dominion was buying votes. Hale's death wasn't an accident. They checked their horses at the stables and walked the last mile. The streets smelled of ink, sweat, and ambition. Posters for rail expansion plastered the walls beside handbills for missing men. Inside the Capitol building, the floorboards shone from polish, and the air was too clean to belong to men who worked the earth. A clerk with gold-rimmed glasses led them down a long hall lined with portraits. At the end waited a heavy oak door. "Governor Stone will see you now," the clerk said. Stone was a tall man, gray at the temples, the kind of soldier who'd traded his rifle for responsibility. His coat hung open, and his sleeves were rolled just enough to show he still worked with his own hands when needed. When Elias and the others entered, he looked up from a ledger and set his pen aside. "Ward," he said. "Boone." His voice carried the gravel of old campaigns. "I've been expecting you." Elias nodded once. "We brought proof. Hale was killed to undo the accord. Dominion plans to strip Silver Vein dry." Stone gestured toward the table. "Show me." Amos opened his satchel and spread the paper's maps, signatures, the original diagrams bearing Henry Boone's seal. Clara stood beside him, one hand steadying the table, the other resting over her child. Stone read in silence for a long while. The only sound was the ticking of a clock and the faint murmur of rain against the windows. When he finally spoke, it was with the tone of a man remembering what justice used to mean. "I knew Henry Boone," he said, "and Peter Ward. Good men, both. The kind this land was supposed to be built on." Elias said nothing. He didn't trust words until they'd proven themselves. Stone took a pen from his desk, dipped it in ink, and wrote a line across the bottom of a new sheet. His hand was slow, deliberate. When he finished, he looked up. "Effective this day. The Silver Vein territory is placed under protection of the governor's office. Water rights will be governed by an independent council, one seat each for ranchers, settlers, the Shoshone, the railway, and the people themselves." He handed the paper to Elias. "It's law now, signed and sealed." Clara exhaled softly, her shoulders trembling. Amos closed his eyes as if in prayer. Finn bowed his head. silent gratitude in the gesture. Jed just muttered, "About damn time." Stone stood, crossing to the window. "You'll have enemies. Ward, Dominion won't forget this. But neither will the people." Elias folded the decree, tucking it inside his coat. "I've lived with enemies all my life. Maybe it's time I had something else." Stone turned to Clara, his expression softening. "You carry more than one future, Mrs. Boone. Take care of it." Clara nodded, eyes glistening. "I will." Outside, thunder rumbled low, not far away. The rain had thickened, washing the dust from the city's streets. When they stepped out onto the porch, the world smelled of wet wood and iron. Elias lifted his face to the sky, letting the drops strike his hat, his hands, his scars. Clara stepped beside him, the decree clutched close to her chest. For the first time in weeks, the sound of water didn't carry fear, it carried promise. They walked down the steps together, boots splashing in shallow puddles. The Capitol bell rang once, long and deep, marking the hour. Elias glanced at the clouds drifting east, toward the valley that had nearly bled itself dry. "Let's go home," he said. The others followed without a word, and as they rode out through the gates of Carson City, the rain followed them soft, steady, like a benediction whispered to those who'd earned it. Morning came quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything, doesn't promise anything, just is. The mist drifted low along the valley, curling around fence posts, settling in the hollows where the first shoots of green had begun to rise. Elias Ward stood at the edge of the field, one hand resting on the post, the other on the badge pinned to his vest. It wasn't bright like the ones city men wore. It was simple hand-forged, dull around the edges, a marshal's star that caught light only when the sun decided it should. Silver vein had changed, not fast, but steady like water finding its way back through broken ground. The pumps turned slow now, steady as heartbeats. Children ran by with their boots kicking mud, and the sound of laughter carried across the open air like something long overdue. Behind him, the town's main street was waking up. The blacksmith's hammer rang soft, not hurried. The church bell gave one long note, enough to remind folks what day it was, but not enough to disturb anyone's peace. The Dominion men were gone. The company offices stood empty, windows broken, the wind passing through like a sigh that had finally found rest. Elias lifted his eyes toward the ridge. From there, the river shimmered silver-white, threading its way down through the valley. They'd rebuilt the sluice gates with Finn's helpwood and iron, bound by trust and sweat. The Shoshone had sent a man named Asa to sit on the council. He didn't speak much, but when he did, everyone listened. Clara walked toward him from the house, slow, careful, one hand resting on her belly, though the child had been born 2 weeks past. A boy, small, quiet, strong enough to grip Elias's finger and not let go. Her hair glowed in the morning light, loose now, the wind tugging strands across her face. She wore Peter's old coat. It hung too big on her shoulders, but she said it made her feel close to him. Elias didn't argue. Some things didn't need words between them. She stopped beside him, eyes on the water. "You never told me what it felt like," she said softly. What felt like peace?" Elias smiled faintly, the kind that didn't reach the lips but softened the lines around his eyes. "Feels a lot like silence," he said. "Only difference is, you ain't afraid of it." Clara nodded. The wind brushed her cheek, and for a moment, they stood there without speaking. Just two souls who had outrun too many ghosts and somehow ended up at the same river. Behind them, Finn was teaching a few children how to notch arrows. He wasn't planning to raise hunters, just teaching them patience. Dr. Amos Finch sat on the porch, pipe in hand, reading from a journal he'd promised to finish before the boy's first birthday. Jed had gone north last week, said he needed to see the ocean once before he died. He'd left his badge on the table, said Elias would make better use of it. The world had a way of turning itself right when no one was watching. Elias adjusted the brim of his hat, squinting toward the far end of the valley. "You ever think Peter would have liked this place? The way it turned out, Clara's gaze softened. "He would have said it took too long," she whispered. He chuckled, low. He always was impatient. They both smiled then, small, fragile smiles that came easier these days. From the barn, the boy's cry rose a single, sharp sound that carried through the quiet like the call of something new. Clara turned, but Elias touched her arm lightly. "I'll get him." He walked to the door, boots brushing through dew and dust, and stepped into the soft dark of the house. The baby was there, wrapped in an old blanket, face red with protest at the lateness of the morning's attention. Elias lifted him, careful, awkward, still learning how to hold something so light without fear of breaking it. The child blinked up at him, the noise already fading. There was something about that gaze steady, unbothered, like the eyes had already seen enough to trust the quiet. "You've got your mother's calm," Elias murmured, "and your uncle's stubborn." He sat down beside the window, the river's gleam caught in the glass. The boy's breathing steadied. Outside, Clara was humming something he couldn't name, a tune older than both of them. Maybe, or something she made up out of habit. He thought about all that had passed the fire in the mines. Nathan's eyes before the end. Silas's greed drowned in his own river of sin. And he thought of the night the accord was signed, the ink still wet, the promise fragile but alive. All of it felt far now, like someone else's dream, but the scars on his hands said otherwise. He reached out, brushed a speck of dust from the boy's cheek. "You'll grow up in a place that's green," he said. "That's more than most men get." Outside, the light shifted, the clouds broke apart, and a single shaft of sun spilled down the slope, turning the river white as bone. It caught the edges of the new wheelhouse, the wet boards of the bridge, the grass bending under the breeze. Clara stepped into the doorway. Watching him, "He's quiet for you," she said. Elias smiled, eyes still on the boy. "Guess he knows I don't talk much." She leaned against the frame, arms folded. "You should rest, Marshall." He looked up, the title still sounding strange on her tongue. "Don't much feel like one." "You don't have to," she said. "You just have to be here." The words settled between them like dust, soft, certain, true. He laid the boy back in the cradle and walked out to the porch. The wind had picked up, bringing with it the scent of pine from the high pass. The badge on his chest caught the light for a heartbeat, then dulled again. Clara joined him, slipping her hand into his. Their fingers intertwined, simple as breathing, no vows spoken, no witnesses needed. The land itself felt enough like a witness. For a long while, they just watched the water move. Every turn of the current seemed to carry something away, a memory, a grief, a voice once sharp, now quiet. The air hummed with it. Life, forgiveness, continuance. Elias squeezed her hand gently. "Looks like it'll keep running a while yet," he said. Clara smiled, eyes tracing the shimmer of light on the current. "So will we." The wind brushed past, lifting the edges of her hair, then went whispering across the fields, carrying the sound of the river farther down the valley. The wheel turned, slow and sure, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the sound of hoofbeats echoed, once soft, distant, fading into the kind of silence that belongs to peace. The sun dipped lower. The light turned gold. Elias reached up, removed his hat, and held it against his chest. The air was warm. The earth was breathing. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment, the water kept moving, and it would. When the dust settles and the gunfire fades, the white river keeps flowing, reminds us of something simple, yet easily forgotten, that redemption doesn't come in a roar, but in the quiet choice to keep going. Elias Ward's story isn't just about the West. It's about the long road every soul must walk from anger to peace. He fought not for glory, but for decency, the kind that survives long after pride and bitterness are gone. Life, like the river in silver vein, will find its way, even through broken ground. We all carry scars, debts, and regrets that time alone cannot heal. But if we keep tending to what's good, a promise kept, a hand held, a small kindness given the water clears. For those who've lived long enough to lose much and still wake to another sunrise, this story is a quiet reminder. Peace is not found by escaping the past, but by forgiving it. The river runs on not to forget what's been lost, but to carry it gently forward into softer days. Thank you, friends, for riding with us through this story, for listening, remembering, and keeping the spirit of the Old West alive. If this tale of courage, loss, and quiet redemption touched something in you, let it keep flowing, like the river itself. Please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes, so these forgotten stories can keep finding their way to hearts that still remember. Until next time, keep your fire warm, your heart kind, and your spirit steady beneath the wide western sky.